Well, while you've been sleeping, I was doing other things. But what I thought I would mention was that screw. That screw that was very hard to remove, that held this into the case. I took a 1.4mm tap, ran it through there, cleaned the thread up nicely. I took a 1.4mm die nut and cleaned up the screw, and the screw now drives into there quite well. Now I'm fairly sure that you haven't got as good a thread engagement there as you once did, but it'll be more than adequate in this case. So I don't need to hunt for another screw, and I don't need to tap this out to a larger size. And the taps and dies was from one of these sets. This set I got at a local electronics shop, but you can probably find similar things online. It has metric taps from 1.1mm up to 2.5mm. A die nut for each and 2 taps in each case for when the inevitable happens and you break one of them. You can see the handle there used for driving the die nuts. For driving the taps, I use one of these. It's called a pin vise. It has interchangeable collets. Works really well. They work really well as a drill too when you're doing tiny holes. So back to the shutter. Well, what if I decided I really did need to remove this stuff? What would I do if I wasn't acting on my own best advice and leaving things alone? Probably unhook this spring to take the tension off it. Remove this screw. Now that screw, I can see the slot in that is very poorly formed, which won't help us later. So I'll remove that screw, remove the return spring, and if I'm very lucky, this bronze bush below it will stay there and keep the spring in place for the main lever. That's just sitting there. That tells me that that spring was under virtually no pre-tension at all, which is good for us in this case because it means it won't be a fight to put it back in place. So take note of where this spring hooks on here. Oh, it's popped in there now. This is obviously a little bit snug on its post, which probably means it's a good thing that I took it apart to clean it, because it just popped back into position then. Right, so we have a little spring here. I'll just get that back over its post so that it's not getting damaged. That's better. We have the main spring, and on this tiny arm here you can see that's got a spring running across here and across here. That is the arm that couples with the blade actuating ring to move the blade actuating ring backwards and forwards. So be very cautious that you don't lose that little spring on the base. Now some of these shutters may have a different arrangement to tension this little arm, but whatever the arrangement, don't lose it. Alright, so that has our... This is just about stripped right down now. if I remove this screw and this screw, I think I can take this off the plate and that'll give me better access in here, and I'll just use a brass wire brush to brush away that rusty looking stuff there. That screw was loose. We've struck a few loose screws on here and some that weren't loose. That one was certainly not tight, but it wasn't loose. Okay, we can take our shutter release, our cable release socket if you like, off here. There's that pin that I mentioned. It's free and free to be lost. Don't lose it, because otherwise you won't have a cable release. This piece should lift off the base plate now. You've got nothing on here now. Nothing that we need to remove, and this just needs to be cleaned with a bit of naphtha. And this, we've got a little tiny patch of corrosion there. It doesn't extend underneath the plate at all, and I'll just use a brass brush to get rid of that. Likewise, there's a little touch of corrosion on here. And of course we had this lever which has corrosion on it because it's been soldered, and whatever they'd used for a flux, the person didn't take great pains to get rid of that flux residue, and as a result we have corrosion. So I can see a little bit of a twist in this. I'm not going to try and untwist that until I've got the shutter back together, or nearly back together. I'll decide whether it needs any attention at all. This whole arm's got a bit of a twist to it. I'm not sure how you go about damaging something like that, but people can always find a way. So the first thing I'm going to do with this is just soak it in a bit of boiling water to start off with, to get rid of any chemical residue that might be on there. And then I'll use a brass wire brush to clean away that corrosion and see what's left. Well, here we have these two pieces cleaned up. There's no trace of corrosion on this piece at all now. This was the end where the corrosion spot was. That looks fine. This piece, you can see there's no lumps of rust on there anymore. It's much cleaner. Here, the chrome loss here, that's never ever going to come good. Basically that's where it's been damaged. Whether I'm just seeing bluing from the heat where a soldering iron's being applied to this, I don't know. It's clear now that these two pieces were originally riveted together at this point, and it would appear that this arm broke here. So the repair is of this arm here at this point by the looks of it, and it's been soldered back into place. It looks, obviously it's a reasonably good soldering job because it's held. But yeah, well, like anything that was being broken, it would have been a lot better had it not been broken. But that's an adequate repair, and that shouldn't stop us getting this back together and making everything go again. As you can see, I've just popped these parts back together so I could check that this lever had a full range of motion from one stop to the other, and there's no problem there, and there's no stiffness of any sort. Of course, it's not lubricated at all at the moment, it's just clean components put back together. So I'm happy with the state of that lever. We've dealt with that screw down here that was damaged. Can clean up components and start putting things back onto this mechanism plate. Having stripped everything off the mechanism plate, now I need to clean it up and start reassembling it. Now this plate appears to be very clean as these things go. And here I'm just using naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid. And I'll do the inside of the lens tube at the same time. That's all good. These other components, you've already seen them back together when I was checking the action of the shutter release lever. Let's get these cleaned and back in place too, and screwed down tight. So this plate has a little locating stud on the bottom which locates into this little hole here. Make sure that the pin is in this piece. That's your cable release piece. And one screw drops in there. And the other screw comes in from the back. Here. Check that that's all sitting correctly. Nothing sitting up, but seated correctly in the hole where that little rivet sat. I'll snug those two screws up. You don't need to go mad tightening screws up, but the screws on this shutter were a little bit loose, so somebody had either been very tentative at tightening them up, or alternatively they just worked their way loose over time, and fasteners can certainly do that. Now we have our main cam here. I'll clean this again with cotton buds and naphtha, and this revolves on this post here, so I'll check that that moves smoothly around that post. Just give a once round that post to make sure there's nothing on there, and clean this lever. It was a little bit stiff before. No obvious reason for that. Normally you would just suspect dried grease perhaps. Sometimes grit will get in places and jam them up. Here I'm just pushing through a bit of cotton. And twirling a toothpick around in there, just to clean that inside surface. So getting this thing back on its post, well, this is going to be a bit of an act, but I'll show you what it looks like when it's back on the post in its correct position, and then we'll take it back off and fit the springs and fight with it. So normally this arm is extended. I can already tell its spring has popped off its post. Get that back over where it should be. And that arm sits over there. This arm is normally, get this around here where it's in its normal position. And to do that, I'll put the blade actuating ring in there temporarily to hold it in place. really I need some sort of hook here to hold that piece. That's where I want it to be, around there. That's better. So it's sitting in its rest position now. That's its normal range of motion. And the spring action that you see here is solely down to the little tiny spring that holds this lever under tension. Its job is to push this lever outwards to keep it engaged with this pin here. So you can see it's sprung loaded. So that's where that lever is going to sit, and I'm just checking its action there to make sure that it's smooth. That feels fine to me. So I'll lubricate this piece, lubricate the centre of that with a little touch of molybdenum paste in my case, but you could use synthetic grease, you could use graphite grease, don't use vegetable oil. Okay, so I'll drop that blade actuating ring out from under there. I know that I need to lubricate that with a touch of molybdenum paste, and it won't need much. Just a wipe through the centre will be all that will need. And we've got to get it back in place with its spring. Now its spring sits on underneath here, and it hooks onto that lever about there from memory. I'll just unhook the spring from this little lever at the moment because it's in my way. I may even remove that completely from there so that I'm not fighting with it. Oh, yeah. It's tricky. I've got to get it off that pin there, which it was off earlier by itself. Of course it's not off now. There, it's off. Just going to take that spring off temporarily. This spring here, this is the main spring. Now most likely this has lost some tension. If you look at the shape of it, look at the shape of that spring, probably right at this point, this should have come out more in a line in this direction, and it's got a sharper bend at that point. I would say that that's what's happened, and we know it didn't have much tension in its rest position. Not as much as I would have expected. Yes, you can see quite a sharp bend right at this point here. So that's certainly the case. I am going to get a pair of pliers and I'm going to adjust that. It'll make it more of a fight to get back in place, but it'll mean the shutter will work better if there's more tension on that release. Well, it's not even the release really, that's your main spring that drives this cam, and that cam in turn drives the blade actuating ring backwards and forwards. So it's not just like the return spring on a lever, it's actually the main force that drives the shutter. So giving this a little bit more tension, or pre-tension, or returning it to something like its original shape will make the shutter work better. Well, I haven't touched this shutter for at least 3 weeks because of reasons, but I better get back onto it and show you how to put this thing back together. Here's the mechanism plate. It's devoid of everything except for the this plate here with the cable release socket on it. And of course that's got its little pin in here that the cable release acts on, and the pin in turn acts on the release arm in the shutter. So we'll start with that. All these parts are cleaned, and I'm going to put the blade actuating ring in first. This piece, because that's the best place to start with this. As you can see, I've got the shutter release and the main cam off, and I'll show you how to put it all back together. So the blade actuating ring, well, that can be lubricated in a couple of ways. I would avoid using grease if I was you. You could use graphite powder. You can use the lead of a soft graphite pencil. Just run that round there, and that will certainly lubricate those surfaces. This goes on in one position, and I'm pretty sure it's that position. There are three things sticking out of it, and they'll only go in one way. Then we have these tiny little washers, and you can see I've still got magnetised tweezers, which is a nuisance, and a magnetised screwdriver, which is being helpful right at the moment. So 5 little screws and 5 washers. I'll get them in place. Well, I would if my tweezers would play the game. Well, these were supposed to be magnetised. They're only magnetised when it suits them. Oh, yeah, so are my tweezers. Ignore that noise, that was just a wax eye bouncing off the windows. Those small birds are a little bit stupid, and they routinely bounce off the windows. Fortunately for them, they only weigh about 7 grams, and so as a result they don't usually come to any harm. I think I'm going to need a toothpick to manoeuvre these pieces around. Something that's not magnetic and stay so that when I nudge things into position, they're not following the tool away afterwards. These screws are always difficult to get in. They're very short and squat. There's virtually no taper on the ends of the screws. There's certainly no countersink or lead into the plate in the shutter because there's not enough depth of material there. And so they're trying to balance the screw on the end of its shank. Right, well, I'll get the last remaining 3 in and we'll move on. Okay, well, all of those screws and washers are in place now, and the blade actuating ring moves freely backwards and forwards. So that part's done. And next I can start putting the main drive cam back in position. And it's useful to have the blade actuating ring in place because we're going to be connecting up to this little piece right here. This is the post the main cam goes on. So I'll get ready for that. Oh, let's just put this on this block here of wood. Brings it up a little bit, makes it easier for me to see what I'm working on. So here's the main cam, here's the main spring. This spring here is the one that operates this little lever, and this little lever couples to the blade actuating ring at this point, and that spring helps keep it in contact with this post and hooks it basically hooks it back over there when it needs to. Right, so these parts are all clean and therefore lubricant free, which in this case is not useful. So I'm just going to put a wipe of molybdenum paste through the centre of this main cam, and you could use synthetic grease for that, you could use graphite grease, but it shouldn't be dry. It needs to be some lubricant of that nature. Right, the main spring that sits over the centre here, and let's see if we can get this thing sitting in position. So our spring sits, yeah, I'm just going to unhook this spring from the lever here to start off with, so that the lever's not flipping around and getting in my way while I'm trying to explain what I'm doing. Basically, the hook on this lever hooks around the lever at this point. So it sits in there like that. And we are going to tension this thing up and hopefully encourage it to stay in place by hooking it over one of these pins. Okay, so I'm going to wind that spring up and hook the end of it over behind that pin. But it's sitting there like a ticking time bomb at the moment. I'll get this spring hooked back over its pin. Okay, so that's our ticking time bomb. That spring is waiting to leap into action and fling the thing across the room. I'm going to hold this with a pair of tweezers to keep that spring from flinging off. And we'll bring this back into the picture. The arm here needs to hook behind the blade actuating ring like so. And the main piece drops over its post like that. Now that's just sitting there very loosely at the moment. I'll put its keeper screw in place and I'll just run that down lightly. I've got to have room to free that spring up that I've hooked up underneath its post over that pin. So I'll do that. I'll lift that spring down and let it fling back. Now I'll run that screw up tight. Now the spring, the end of the spring that was under tension is now sitting right here. We're going to want to swing that all the way around to this point where it will be kept behind this brass piece. So here is where you need two sets of hands just about. This is just, it's awkward but it's doable. And awkward as it is, it's probably the easiest way to achieve this. Right, the pieces that we've got to add at this point. Now this little brass standoff, now that's relieved underneath. That's where the spring hook's underneath it. This latch, which holds our main cam in the latched position. The shoulder screw that holds this lever in position and also has a shoulder for this spring to wind around. Now, I can tell you, you can fit that spring after you've got the screw in place. You don't need to put it on the screw first. And I suggest that you don't, because it's just one more complication you can probably do without. Now at this stage you really do need to have your tools at the ready where you can grab them easily, because you'll only have one hand free to do this, because one hand will be involved in holding that spring back out of the way while under tension, while you fit this piece and then stack this piece on top of it and then run that screw into it, and when the screw's done up then you can release the spring and it'll drop back under that brass bush. And all this is possible. So I want to get that spring, which as I say is under tension. I'm bringing it all the way around to there. Now everything here is trying to run away. I'll put that brass bush there. I might just see if I can grab that with my left hand. That's easier because I'm right-handed. We're in the picture still, yes we are, because I really don't want to have to record this again. Now, I suppose I could if I had to, but I prefer not to. There's the screw. Now I've still got my left tweezers here in the left hand are holding that spring in position. I run that screw down, check that it's snug. I'm getting a better screwdriver. Just nip that screw up. Now I can release this spring, and the spring is now firmly located against that brass bush here. And our lever is now in place. The screw in the middle, we can check that that's tight. And the other piece we need to put in place is this spring. Well, with a bit of manoeuvring we can stretch that spring out over that screw head. So I've got a toothpick in one hand here. Let's see if we can achieve this without it flying across the room. Yeah, it's in place. One end hooks under here. The other end gets lifted up and hooks behind the post at this point. So now we have a working latch, and if we cock the shutter, the latch drops into place and the shutter would be held in the cocked position. And when we release it, the blade actuating ring would move to the end of its travel. There's our release, there's our release. That one. And then return again. If we had the B lever in place, it would have dropped in and latched that in place. So the difficult part is all behind us, because getting this thing in place is the tricky bit. Everything else is pretty simple by comparison.